Thank you to everyone who helped make this symposium possible, and thank you to each of you for being here as we celebrate our 19th annual symposium. I'd also like to extend a special thank you to our keynote speaker, Nalini Nadkarni. Nalini is a professor of biology at the University of Utah, a renowned forest ecologist, and host of KUER's weekly Tree Note program. Her remarkable career blends scientific research on rainforest canopy ecosystems with creative public engagement, helping people better understand the importance of trees and nature. She brings deep insight into how forests respond to disturbance and how they recover, knowledge informed not only by ecology, but through collaboration with experts across academic fields and community sectors. Today, Nalini will talk about how we harness the creative potential of disturbance by working together, seeking knowledge from many sources, and taking small collective actions. Her message is truly inspiring. Please join me in welcoming Professor Nalini Nadkarni.
Great. Well, thanks, Bob, and thanks, Lynn, for bringing together all of those who are connected with watersheds. I feel that watershed work right now is more important than ever because of the disturbances that are affecting our watersheds, our lives, and our planet. And I define disturbance as a sudden or unpredictable change, an interruption in the state of peace or calm or quiet. And disturbances in watersheds are not only wildfires and floods, but also rapid and unexpected changes in forest policy, in forest management, and watershed funding, and our emotional responses to those disturbances. And I think in facing these disturbances, we find ourselves balancing on something like this knife ridge between hope and despair. If we fall too much on the side of hope, we think other people will take care of things. If we fall too much on the side of despair, we become immobilized. And we know that disturbances have negative connotations. That's even reflected in our language: catastrophic wildfires, devastating floods. But this morning, I'd like to consider how disturbances, while acknowledging their negative effects, can lead to generating some unforeseen solutions to these problems that will keep us walking forward on the knife ridge of hope and despair. Now, as you heard from the introduction, I am not a watershed ecologist, but rather a forest ecologist and a tree advocate. But I see trees as being fundamental to watersheds, first because many watersheds hold on to trees, but also that they share the basic dendritic structure with trees. Whenever I see a map of a watershed, I immediately transform it into a tree. And so today I'm going to give a talk in 3 parts. First, I'll discuss a little bit about my studies in forest canopy ecology, which led to some interdisciplinary exploration of disturbance and recovery, which led to what I call tapestry thinking and tapestry actions that might be useful for those who are in the watershed arena. My own engagement with trees started when I climbed them as a little kid in Bethesda, Maryland. Treetops became my place, my refuge, and I remember when I was 8 years old, I took a little oath to myself that when I became a grown-up, I was going to do something to protect and support trees, just as they supported and protected me. And that led to my academic career in forest ecology. I chose to specialize in forest canopy ecology. And when I was a graduate student 40 years ago, the canopy was virtually unknown scientifically. It was called the last biotic frontier. Well, I've studied canopy plants in wet forests of Costa Rica and Washington State, and I've learned that these canopy plants have no root connections to the forest floor, nor to the host trees that support them, but rather they have evolved mechanisms to intercept and retain nutrients that are dissolved in rain and cloud water. And so, although they make up only 10% of the above-ground biomass of these wet forests, they're responsible for intercepting and retaining up to 60% of atmospheric nitrogen that comes from outside the ecosystem. So these canopy-dwelling plants are critical players in ecosystem nutrient cycles. And these plants also act as keystone elements for wildlife. In my Costa Rica study site, 1/3 of all of the foraging visits of birds are to the canopy plants, not to the host trees. Well, since their roles are so critical, I studied the effects of physical disturbance on these canopy plants to learn about their resiliency. I predicted that since these canopy plants are so lush and so diverse, that they would quickly return to their original communities. And I also predicted that regrowth would occur by encroachment from the side, like grass on a sidewalk. Well, I was wrong in both cases. Instead of encroaching from the side, these plants initiated discovery from the moisture underside of the branch and then climbed up and around the branch for recovery. And that recovery was incredibly slow. It took 13 years for anything to regenerate. And now, 30 years later, only 40% of the biomass has returned. And this is the way I remember that. When it's gone, it's gone. And maybe you'll be a little lucky if you get some regrowth growing up from the bottom. But most interestingly, regrowth included a different set of plants from the original. On your left, you see the original plant communities, and on the right are the returning communities after 30 years. So what has returned is neither the original plant community nor the early disturbed state after clearing. Instead, we have a plant community with altogether different plant composition and structure. Of course, disturbances are occurring at much larger spatial scales than those stripped branches due to climate change and forest fragmentation, and conversion of primary forests to pastures is increasing. And that disturbance isolates original primary forest trees and pastures, leaving them very far from their pollinators and their seed dispersers. But it was very hard for me to find funding to study this because reviewers of my grant proposals pointed out that there's a lack of generalizable theory about relic structures in the arena of ecological structures. And so I thought perhaps other fields that are concerned with disturbance might provide useful theories and generalizable insights. For after all, clear-cuts and pastures within a landscape of primary forests might be analogous to a patch of burned skin in a landscape of healthy skin. So the field of burn trauma and other fields that are concerned with disturbance might have theory or protocols or models that could be useful to ecologists like me. So in 2014, I recruited faculty from the University of Utah from fields that deal with disturbance to participate in a colloquium on disturbance and recovery, all of these fields that you see here. We met for 2 hours a month for a year. In the first semester, each faculty provided a lecture about their approaches, theories, and tools in his or her own field. And during the second semester, we articulated integrative and emerging themes, what we called precepts. And today, this morning, I'll share just 3 of those precepts with you. The first precept is the importance of seeking information from multiple sources. Our expert in traffic engineering cited his disturbances as traffic jams, and his traffic engineering colleagues use information from multiple sources: fluid dynamic theories, simulations, and massive cell phone data sets to predict and mitigate those disturbances. And that related to my understanding of relic trees. I realized that I needed to seek knowledge from multiple sources, not only the scientific literature, but to talk about relic trees with the farmers themselves and with the women who collect medicinal plants from them. The second precept is to extend and strengthen your web of relationships. Our faculty from human development studies attachment theory. If an infant loses a parent through death, they may later have trouble forming trusting relationships with others. But if the web of relationships of their family can extend an alternate figure, an uncle or a grandparent, to take on those parental functions, that can mitigate the negative effects of losing a parent. And that also fit my relic trees. Trees that are isolated in relic tree islands can maintain their reproductive capacity if they can maintain their web of relationships. If even a subset of their pollinators and fruit dispersers can cross that ocean of pasture, they can become what we call regeneration nuclei, from which regrowth can take place. And our third precept, I think was our biggest insight, is that we have to recognize that there's actually a broad spectrum of consequences of disturbances, not just negative as we tend to think of them, but our researcher in refugee studies acknowledged the loss of culture, the loss of sense of place and resources that displaced populations experience when they are forced to move. But she also noted that refugee women find education possible when they move to the United States, which would not be possible in their home countries. And that led to this deeper insight involving the nature of disturbance and recovery. We tend to think that systems, whether forest ecosystems or watersheds or the human body, starts out in its original state, becomes disturbed, and then, if recovery is successful, it returns to its original state. But what we learned in our discussions was that systems more often move towards another recovery. It arrives at what we started calling a third state, neither the original state nor the disturbed state, but something different than both. And that is exactly what happened in my disturbed canopy plant communities. If you remember, what came back was neither the original state nor the early disturbed state, but a new community of different composition and structure. And our artist in the colloquium, a modern dancer, was surprised that our experts in science and medicine view disturbance as wholly negative. For her, as an artist, disturbance is actually required for progress. In dance, the disturbance or disruption of traditional ballet allowed a new modern dance form to emerge. And so she calls disturbance a portal to the new. So with these insights, I started doing research efforts of the effects of disturbance on canopy plant communities in the Olympic Park, the Olympic rainforest in Washington State. My students and I set up camp in a grove of big leaf maple trees. We climbed up on our ropes, and as I was leaning over a branch about 60 feet above the floor, I suddenly felt no tension in the rope. Now you'd think that I would have hit some of the branches on the way down, but as my graduate students later said, I fell 60 feet like a silent sack of sand. I was medevaced out to a trauma center in Seattle. I had exploded 5 vertebrae, fractured 9 ribs, broke my pelvis in 3 places, lacerated my lung, cracked my C2 vertebrae, punctured my spleen, broken my fibula, and sustained traumatic brain injury. That sounds really bad. And it was a huge physical and emotional disturbance in my life. But during my early recovery, I realized that I might apply those precepts of the colloquium to my own recovery. So I had to seek knowledge from diverse sources. And although I gained knowledge from a traditional source, my doctors, I also gained insights from my nurses and my therapists and my many roommates in the hospital, and by thinking about resiliency in the processes of nature. Second precept, that the web of relationships was critical to my recovery. And I know that the presence and support of my family and my friends and my colleagues and the people in my PT sessions and a trauma support group were important. And these were not just my human web of relationships, it involved also my connections to nature, because I so wanted to get back to my forests for my research, my recreation, and my spiritual well-being. And third, I needed to figure out my own third state. My disturbance had put a stop in my work life and in the dynamics of my personal life. And it was really an opportunity to ask myself new questions. Because I knew who I had been: a mom, a wife, an academic, a forest ecologist, a bicyclist, a public speaker, a winner of honorary degrees. But what would be my third state? And I have to tell you that now, 10 years later, it's still a work in progress. I do continue my canopy research because science for me is a joy and a sense of contribution. But I also now recognize the ubiquity of disturbance and the brevity of life. So I now take time to do different things. I've learned to turn wooden bowls and to learn about trees in a different way with my hands. My husband and I started a tradition called Monday Home Evening. I now cook dinners for 30 of our friends every week, which has built a human community and strengthened my web of relationships. And as a grandmother, I love to spend time with my little Sierra. Well, My experience with my own disturbance has also made me more sensitive to other disturbances, not just ecological disruptions. And I began thinking about the current disturbances that are affecting people's relationships to trees and to nature because of the separation and isolation due to urbanization and more virtual instead of real connections to the world. And so although I realize that scientific contribution to the scientific record is important, I felt I also needed to do work that would more directly raise awareness of the importance of trees to people to incite action to protect forests. And work towards fulfilling that oath that the little 8-year-old Nalini had made so many years ago. I had to ask myself, how might I create a tapestry of care and concern for trees that would involve people outside the realm of science and conservation? I began giving public lectures, doing popular writing, making documentary films through traditional science educational institutions like museums and botanic gardens, but I soon realized that the people in the audiences, or the people who read or watched those films, were people who already value nature. So how might I instill a sense of protection for trees for those who might hold other perceptions and values of nature? And how could I do that with people who do not or cannot get connections to nature because of physical or financial or cultural barriers? So to think about that, I had to sort of turn the tables and think about what I am not interested in, and what would I not contribute to, and what would it take for me to get interested in that? Well, I have to say, I've never been part of a family or a social group that really cares about professional sports. Like, I really don't give a darn who wins the World Series. But I have learned that all bats in the American and National League are made of wood. Maple or ash or hickory. Now that is interesting to me. And so now I will gladly sit through a baseball game because I have a connection to a thing that I didn't value, to something that I have spent my entire life pursuing. I don't have to buy season tickets to the Bees, but I can have conversations with people who are baseball fans because now we share a point of intersection. So I have applied that to my public engagement, to my tapestry thinking, and I started with young girls. You know, because I found my strong connections to trees when I climbed them as a young girl. But what about little girls who grow up in New York City or Tokyo or Nairobi where they don't have trees to climb? I needed to find something that they were already connected to, already have a proclivity for, and link trees to that. And the obvious answer to that was Barbie. And so we started creating treetop Barbies. I took a symbol that's marketed to millions through their recreational values and morphed it to embody women who are women scientists who make discoveries in treetops. Surprisingly, Mattel said no when I offered it to them in 2004. So my students and I made it and them anyway. We bought used Barbies at Deseret Industries. We enlisted volunteer seamstresses to make her little outfits. And we created a booklet that she came along with about canopy plants of the Pacific Northwest. We made them available at science conferences on my little tiny academic website. So it was positive, but it was very small scale. Well, amazingly, in 2022, I got a phone call from National Geographic. National Geographic and Mattel had partnered to make a set of Explorer Barbies. They invited me to be an advisor on that, and as a thank you, they made a Nalini look-alike, one-of-a-kind treetop Barbie. Now, I did suggest ground support Ken, but that did not get a lot of traction. But it led me to think about finding other threads of other groups to weave into this tapestry of care and concern. And I chose faith-based groups because over 80% of the world's population self-identifies as being religious or believing in God, a much greater percentage than those who identify as being conservationists. But I didn't want to fall into this creation versus evolution conflict, so my approach was to draw upon the authorities of the holy scriptures of world religions rather than on scientific data. So I read the religious scriptures of the Holy Bible, the Talmud, the Book of Mormon, and other scriptures, and extracted all the verses that pertain to trees and forests, as well as the religious traditions that draw upon trees and forests, and created from that a sermon called Trees and Spirituality, which I deliver from the pulpits of churches and synagogues and temples. Now, we can also recognize that churchyards are considered sacred ground by congregants. So we have mapped trees in churchyards and created booklets with scientific information and scriptural information about the species that grow in those churchyards and distribute those to congregants. And that has led to tree plantings and bioblitzes in churches and on seminary grounds. So weaving together these ecological and religious values has been very positive, and it has led to a third state of connections between two sectors, science and religion, that seem very far apart. Another thread to weave into this tapestry is making fashion as a force of nature. Now, I know this is odd because we ecologists and watershed scientists wear clothes like what you see there over there, but my approach was to take botanically correct images of trees and print them on fabric, and then create garments with an accompanying hang tag with information on the biota and conservation of that species, so that each person wearing this garment can inform and inspire people who find clothing and fashion interesting and important. So you can see this handsome jacket that I'm wearing. So ask me about, when you see me later today, ask me about Piper aridum, a plant that grows in the Monteverde cloud forest, same genus as the black pepper you put on your scrambled eggs this morning. And if you want to help to contribute to it, you might want to join the Nature Conservancy. Well, most recently, I've spent most of my public engagement time with people who live and work in the most nature-deficit environments of carceral institutions, which house over 2 million adults and 50,000 incarcerated youth, to bring science and scientists inside state prisons and county jails and juvenile detention centers. I delivered talks about trees, and the 400 other scientists that we have engaged talk about their research topics from arboriculture to zoology. We've also developed wonderful collaborations with conservation groups to train inmates as incarcerated citizen scientists, and they have reared endangered species for existing restoration projects like the Oregon spotted frog, the Taylor checker spot butterfly, endangered plants, and in the Salt Lake County Jail have built nesting boxes for the American kestrel. One research project involving regional watersheds is work by Karen Ketterning at Utah State University. She gained the help of people incarcerated at Salt Lake County Jail to explore the horticulture of native bulrushes to counteract the invasive Phragmites. And so, with the catalyst of these disturbances, I have found that it is possible to weave a tapestry of understanding and care that is composed of the ecological values as the vertical threads, and these very different threads of diverse societal threads as the horizontal threads, to better understand and protect nature. And I think that really behaves like a real tapestry, something that is connected, that is complex, that is strong, that is useful, that is beautiful, and that is hopeful. But still, as we know, the disturbances are increasing, and we can still feel that pull towards despair. And many of these disturbances seem intractable and immovable, like a regional situation and disturbance of the Great Salt Lake. I don't have to tell this group about how climate change and human activities are reducing water levels and disturb so much in our watershed. That pushes us towards despair. But I also observe many hopeful efforts, and many of those hopeful efforts will be discussed today and tomorrow during this symposium, and I'll just mention one, since I'm on the board of trustees of the Nature Conservancy. I want to recognize the great work that they've done since 1984 in protecting the Great Salt Lake's water and its associated biota. I think the most important of TNC and much of the work that you do is building diverse and trusted collaborations. And that brings us to this meeting, this critical 2025 Salt Lake County watershed. This meeting is fostering what so many of you are already carrying out, the 3 precepts that have emerged from our colloquium. First, you are seeking knowledge from diverse sources. The organizers have gathered participants of all ages, all genders, and multiple facets of society, science and policy and management and tribal organizers and community organizers. The second precept of this symposium is to strengthen the web of relationships among these sectors during the meeting and, more importantly, after the meeting. So that, and to third, it is this group that is going to develop priorities and initiatives to create that third state of watersheds in Salt Lake County and beyond. That can lead us through the portal of the new into a hopeful new state. And to catalyze that, I'd like to invite you to participate in a little exercise. First, I'll describe it, and then you can do it. So when I give a harmonica signal, I want you to make an acquaintance with someone whom you don't know, not someone who's sitting at your table who you do know. What you're going to do is you're going to take your right hand, yes, thank you, and you are going to reach over to somebody that you don't know. And you are going to shake their hand to introduce yourself and give them your name, your organization, if you do belong to an organization, and tell them in 1 minute, describe your work. And after 1 minute, I know it's short, but this is just an introduction, the second person will then give him or her your name, his or her name, his or her organization, and describe that for 1 minute. Understood? Looking around for people you don't know? Your target person? Okay, go. Go ahead and switch people. Okay, let's sit back down. I hope you made a good new friend. For the rest of the meeting, feel free to stalk this person and find out more about them. And at the same time, as you move through this meeting, please think about shaking the hands and introducing yourself and describing your work to other people as you wait for coffee, as you wait for a new session to begin, because I think that will help us diversify our sources of knowledge, enhance our web of relationships, and move towards a positive third state. Well, one final message before I end is it's really about the scale of the impacts of our work. The work of tapestry thinking can occur at all scales, not just large scales, but small scales. And I mentioned earlier TNC, which is the largest conservation group in the world. But small groups and small organizations and even individuals can also have tremendous impact. And I learned this by observing trees. The massive trunks and deep roots of old-growth trees make trees seem intractable, immovable, just like the seemingly immovable problems that disturbances cause. But if you look upward into the canopy, you can see that each leaf on that tree, each tiny twig, is moving just a little bit. And I once recorded those small, subtle movements, the kinds of wind-aided actions that I had often dismissed as being too tiny to matter. I tied the tip of a paintbrush with green paint onto the tip of a twig, and when the wind blew, I held up a canvas for 2 minutes. And the result was a wonderful piece of tree art, but I needed to find out how far those twigs had moved. And so I measured all the line segments and summed them up and multiplied them by the number of twigs per branch, the number of branches per tree, and the number of minutes per year to get the total distance that those twigs collectively had moved in 1 year. Any guesses? 186,540 miles. That's 7 times around the equator of our planet Earth. So by analogy of each of us, a whole tree's worth of twigs do a very small thing to raise the awareness of the importance of trees and watersheds. Our progress will go enormous distances. And I did a little bit of math. There are 325 million people in our country. There are 6.2 million scientists. And if each one has a conversation about science and watersheds with just 52 people a year, that's just 1 person a week, we will have spoken with every single person in our country. How can we do that? I'll give you a couple of suggestions. I've noticed that many young women care a lot about fingernails. I am not a fingernail person, but I occasionally go to get a manicure, and I ask the manicurist to paint trees with lurid green polish on my fingernails. And so for 3 weeks before it chips away, I have great conversation with young women about trees. When I get on an airplane, I throw up slides of my rainforest study site, shift my laptop slightly to the right, and great conversations emerge. So whether our efforts are big or little, whether they concern ecology or soils or policy or law or industry or tribal issues, whether they occur in the field or in laboratories, in legislative halls, in churches, or in prisons, what matters is that we share our knowledge and our actions about trees and about watersheds because we hold them literally in our hearts. And that love for the places and the biota that we study will lead us toward hope and away from despair, a tapestry of actions to understand, to inclusively manage, and to protect the watersheds that we care for, so that we can sustain something that is like a real tapestry, that is connected, complex, strong, useful, beautiful, and hopeful. Thank you. Happily, we have time for a few questions I just learned. So if you have questions, comments, suggestions about tapestry actions, I think there are 2 microphones on the side and helpers with that on the side who just raised their hands.
Nalini, I want to thank you for really putting your money where your mouth is and being one of the best ambassadors for nature that I've ever known or even heard of. So thank you. And my question is, you kept mentioning, during these times of feeling down and divisiveness in the politics right now, I know that everyone in this room who are keeping their head down and doing incredible work in the partnerships that we all have know that we will be achieving that, third state of environmental protection here in our watershed. But for those of us who are working on the larger, the national issues, the regional issues, and during this time where the current administration is setting us, I fear, so far back, not sending anyone to the climate accords, all these cuts in fundings to research universities, all the federal grants for the science that a lot of us are doing. Do you see a third state coming after this administration for those of us working on the bigger picture, or have we been set too far back with this administration? I'm looking for some hope here.
Thanks, Allie. I think that just as we who are encountering a situation before a disturbance, it's very hard to imagine or articulate or even plan for the post-disturbance state, because that's the nature of disturbance, that it disrupts us and we don't know what's going to be happening. I remember several weeks after my disturbance of falling out of a tree, I encountered, one of my old friends came to visit me in the hospital, and I said, "Oh my gosh, Jean, I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know if I'm going to get back to myself. I'm so nervous about not knowing what I can imagine for myself in the future." And she, as a wise woman, said, "Well, Nalini, you've been stopped. You're going to go through a period of boredom and patience and fear until you may emerge into a new state that includes creativity and spirituality." And I went, whoa, now there's a promise. But I had to accept that I had to go through boredom, patience, and fear before I could get to that understanding of what my third state would be. So I think the answer is twofold. One is that we have to hold on to our promise of the third state without knowing what it's going to look like or be like or act like, and we don't even know how to build towards it. But I think what we also have to do is put ourselves in the mindset of one of those little leaves on the trees that painted that picture, which is that a leaf itself is very small, but it's connected to a twig with other small leaves, and that twig is connected to a branch with other twigs, and that branch is connected to the tree. So I think the answer to the despair that we often feel when we look at the big scale, the national and international level, is yes, I have to go through this period of boredom, patience, and fear, but I know that I can continue my work as a little leaf because it is contributing energy and nutrients into that big tree that will persist over time, over decades, over centuries even perhaps, into that third state.
Hi, thank you so much for coming and giving your talk today. I find you to be such an excellent communicator, and I'm giving a talk later on that. And I just wanted to see what advice you had for fellow scientists on how to be a better communicator with these topics. You seem to do a great job about relating to your audience on values and activities and integrating it into their daily life. So what would you say is a great way to engage scientists with the community? Because I know a lot of us like to be a little hermit-like, and not everyone goes into science to talk to people, so I would love to hear your advice on that.
I think I have an advantage over many people because my own background is a mixed one. My dad was from India. He was a Hindu. He was a scientist. My mother was from Brooklyn, New York. She was an Orthodox Jew. She was a language specialist. And so from birth, really, I was exposed to this combination of cultures, language, cuisine, and so forth. Curried bagels were our favorite dinner. And so what I learned was that, in fact, when you look at the surface of something like a religion, like Hinduism, there are many gods, many deities that you depict everywhere and put up statues. In Judaism, you don't have any representation of gods at all. But in fact, the religions of my parents were really at their heart, the essence was the same. What religions are about is having respect for other people, of doing good in the world, of feeling a sense of community. And so I learned that things that look different on the outside may not be so very different. But in terms of what I've learned from that and from my work with other groups is that the primary thing that we as scientists need to keep in mind is what we call intellectual humility. As scientists, I know I was raised in my academic community to think that science was the way of knowing that we had to adhere to because it was the right way to come to understand systems or the world. But what I learned over this time of working with other kinds of groups is to practice intellectual humility. And that doesn't mean I have to be become a Presbyterian or a Baptist to give a sermon in a Presbyterian church or a Baptist church. It means I need to have respect for them enough to say, I'm going to read your Bible and try to understand how you understand trees, and then I'm going to talk about it so that we can find some common ground that, in fact, all of us, those 328 references in the Old Testament to trees, are basically saying the same as what I have learned in my 40 years of forest ecology research, which is trees are important for the well-being of ecosystems. And I don't have to say whether that's because God made trees or because they evolved over evolutionary time. We can sit and say trees are really great and we need to do something to protect them. So intellectual humility allows us to move into a community, not become that community, not even agree with that community, but to say, let's find something we can agree on in order to have conversations, interchange, and engagement over that. And who knows what it might leak into as we start seeing each other as humans who are concerned about the same thing. Thanks.
Wow.